Pro wrestling retirements have always been quite a lot like superhero deaths, in that the chances of them being permanent are never 100%. So this is why it rarely comes as a surprise whenever an old face from the past decides to hit the ring again and start the second phase of their career. But what are the biggest examples of this happening in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than the Nature Boy himself, Ric Flair. Yes, despite getting arguably the greatest send-off ever at WrestleMania 24 when he was put out to pasture by Shawn Michaels, the former 16-time plus world champion just wasn't ready to hang up his boots quite yet. Hell, he's even said this much in the years since, with him later confirming in interviews that he didn't feel like he'd given all he could give, and that he was only calling it quits on the advice of Vince McMahon himself. But Vince McMahon didn't own TNA. No, that company had a completely different management structure, one which was only too happy to allow Rick to come in for a few more dates. And so that's what led to him breaking the retirement stipulation less than 2 years after it was put in place, with him at this point lacing up his boots once more to take on the likes of Abyss, Jeff Jarrett, Rob Van Dam, and his old foe, Hulk Hogan. That's right, TNA at the start of the 2010s was already on its way down, as it had by then become swollen with ex-WWE stars. Not that this worried the Nature Boy though, because as long as someone was letting him wrestle again, he was only too happy to come on board. And it wouldn't just be wrestling he'd do here either. No, he'd also end up managing a modern-day incarnation of the Four Horsemen named Fortune, a stable which also included AJ Styles, Frankie Kazarian, Robert Roode, James Storm, and Desmond Wolfe. Come 2012, however, Ric Flair's time with TNA would have come to an end, and he'd have returned to WWE once more. Did this mean Vince McMahon had undergone a change of heart and was now going to let him wrestle again? No, but it did mean Rick had finally gotten the bug out of his system, for a while at least, and so was happy to just return to playing the role of legend who occasionally popped up on Raw instead. And at this point, the same thing could have been said for another legend that had gotten a second run after being forced to enter retirement before they wanted to. And this is because come 2010, Shawn Michaels had also finally decided to hang up his boots once and for all. That is, if we ignore his one-night-only comeback at 2018's Crown Jewel. Of course, prior to his second retirement though, HBK had shocked everyone when, in 2002, he overcame what had supposedly been a crippling back injury and was able to hit the ring once more. And what made this return all the more special was that he was arguably even better this time around than he had been during his first spell in the ring. A tall achievement considering how good he was back then. Yes, if Shawn Michaels 1.0 was one of the best wrestlers in the world, then Shawn Michaels 2.0 was a step above even this, with him by then reaching the point of being a once-in-a-generation level talent. Need any evidence such a thing was the case? All you have to do is look towards his phenomenal portfolio of matches he put out against opponents as varied as Triple H, John Cena, Chris Jericho, Kurt Angle, and The Undertaker. Really, you could make a solid argument that during the second phase of his career, the four-time world champion was the greatest to ever do it. He was certainly the greatest example of a man who had come out of retirement and quickly proven he hadn't lost a step at this point. Hell, his pair of WrestleMania matches against the Dead Man are to this day still considered among the best of all time. So really, who else could compete with him in this area? Well, as it happens, there would be one man who had a Hall of Fame career cut short due to injury that also managed to make his return at a later date and prove he was just as good as ever, if not better. Who are we talking about here? Why, who else but Bryan Danielson? That's right, arguably the greatest wrestler alive, the American Dragon, has been outshining his peers since all the way back during his days working for Ring of Honor in the early 2000s. That said, while this was probably the creative peak of his first run, the art phase of his career if you will, it was when he joined WWE in 2009 and there took up the new moniker of Daniel Bryan that he reached levels of commercial success most could never have dreamed of for him. Why was that? Well, Bryan is a short guy, certainly not the kind of performer you'd expect to get over in a big way with Vince McMahon. But fans loved him so much that the boss ended up being forced to push him to the top of the card anyway. And this looked like a position he was going to remain in for the foreseeable future, all the way up until concussion-related seizures forced things to go in a different direction, with that direction being retirement. That said, for as depressing as this was for both Danielson and his fans alike, he was never one to quit, and so that was why he'd spend the next 3 years rehabilitating his brain to the point doctors felt comfortable letting him in the ring again. And with him now cleared once more, he was able to have an arguably even better second run than Shawn Michaels did, as not only would he become WWE Champion once more, then main event WrestleMania for a second time, but he'd also make the jump over to All Elite Wrestling, where the amount of 5-star classics he's had in under 2 years has been so high, it honestly beggars belief. Yes, after some great bouts against the likes of Kenny Omega, Hangman Page, and MJF, just to name a few, we're now seemingly entering his retirement run as a full-time wrestler, and we can only imagine what else he has planned over the next year. Will we see Bryan Danielson show up at the Tokyo Dome? Will we see him get that much-anticipated rematch against the Best Bout Machine? Or will we even see him win the AEW World title? The possibilities are endless. Hell, we might even see him step in the ring once more with our next subject, because after spinal stenosis forced him into retirement in 2011, Adam Copeland was able to make a shocking return himself 9 years later. Of course, no one saw this coming ahead of time though, because as far as fans knew, the Toronto native's hopes of ever lacing up his boots again were 0-0. But with advances in medical technology meaning he was able to finally get cleared in 2020, he'd be allowed to make a surprise return at that year's Royal Rumble, with him receiving one of the biggest pops of the modern era in the process. Sadly though, some of the shine of Edge's return was taken away due to the global shutdown which occurred mere months later, meaning his first year of matches under his comeback would take place in front of either an empty arena or the Thunderdome. But once fans returned in 2021, he was able to rectify this by having some absolute bangers in front of rabid crowds against opponents such as Roman Reigns, Finn Balor, and Seth Rollins. Hell, at one point he'd even start his own stable, the Judgment Day. And while he's no longer the leader of this group, using what he taught them, they've since gone on to become arguably the best thing about WWE TV, and the most dominating force Raw has seen in years. So maybe that was why, content in having helped the next generation of stars in New York get over, Edge decided to follow in the footsteps of Bryan Danielson by making the jump over to AEW in October of 2023, after having one final goodbye match on SmackDown against Sheamus. And during his brief time in Jacksonville, so far he's not only been able to involve himself in storylines with young up-and-comers like Darby Allin and Nick Wayne, but he's also gotten to reignite a feud with an old friend of his, someone who also came out of retirement years after it was assumed he was done forever, and that's Christian Cage. Yes, Christian will forever go down as one of the more underrated wrestlers of his era, and that's because ever since debuting in the 90s, he's been one of the best in-ring performers at any given point. It's what made him such an important figure during the TLC days of the WWF Tag Team division, in fact, and it's also what made him get to the point where in 2010 he could finally win a world title in the Fed. Unfortunately though, just 4 years after this, the Toronto-born star would have to retire from the ring following a series of concussions he'd picked up over the years. But while this might have seemed like the end of the line forever at the time, by 2021, he'd have been cleared by doctors once more, and so would be allowed to appear as a surprise entrant in that year's Royal Rumble match. Would this lead to a career renaissance? Well, not quite yet, as WWE didn't re-sign him. No, he would instead head over to AEW in March of that same year, just in time for their Revolution pay-per-view. And while some may have balked at this signing initially, feeling it was a little too TNA of Khan to bring in a WWE legend who was apparently past his prime, Christian Cage soon proved all his naysayers wrong when he had a great pay-per-view main event against Kenny Omega, all while he was simultaneously serving as a mentor to both Jungle Boy and Luchasaurus. Then, as if that weren't enough, he'd turn heel on Jungle Boy and morph into his most recent incarnation, an evil villain ripped straight out of a James Bond film. And with him currently in the midst of reviving the TNT title and making it relevant again after a period of instability, you could argue his value has never been greater than it is now. But that's not the only example of someone who found a new life by becoming all elite after they thought they'd never wrestle again, because while Christian is killing it over in the men's division, up until very recently, the women's division in AEW belonged to one woman, and one woman only, Sera. Yes, it was a sight most people thought they'd never see, but in September of 2022 at the Dynamite Special Edition Grand Slam, Sera Bevis made her return to the ring a full 4 years after spinal stenosis had also forced her into retirement. And that injury had been such a huge shame at the time because prior to this, Paige, as she was known, was one of the early originators of the women's revolution in WWE. Were it not for her work in NXT with the likes of Emma, in fact, it's possible the Four Horsewomen would never have been able to rise and take over the industry. So when she announced she could no longer wrestle in April of 2018, it hit particularly hard for audiences. But as we've seen already today, medical advancements mean things can always change, and this was what led to Sera signing on the dotted line with Tony Khan in 2022, and from there going on to have a second run in the ring, a run which began with a highly anticipated match against Britt Baker 1 month later at Full Gear. And since this point, she's continued to remain at the top of the division by not only forming a stable with Toni Storm and Ruby Soho named the Outcasts, but also by winning the AEW Women's World title in front of 72,000 of her people at Wembley Stadium in August of 2023. A feat which must have been overwhelming for the woman who thought her days in the ring were done forever at one point. Sure, since her big win in England, she's lost the title back to Hikaru Shida, but that doesn't mean her rebirth is over yet. No, given the matches she's still yet to have against the likes of Jamie Hayter, Thunder Rosa, and possibly even Mercedes Moné, we're sure Sera still has plenty of years left in her. After all, she's still only 31 years old, which wasn't a million miles away from the age our next subject was when she made her return after a head injury forced her to first retire in 2006. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Becky Lynch? That's right, before she was a WrestleMania main eventer, before she was even one of the 4 horsewomen, Rebecca Quinn was a struggling indie performer trying her best to get herself over on the UK and European scenes. But any dream she had of reaching the next level at this point would tragically be cut short when, while wrestling in Germany in September of 2006, she'd suffer a blow to the head which left her with debilitating headaches and a loud buzzing in her left ear afterwards. Obviously then this was a cause for concern, so the Irish woman went to see a doctor who subsequently diagnosed her with possible 8th cranial nerve damage, and because of that she'd be forced to retire from the ring altogether. But thankfully, this wouldn't be the end of her story entirely, because 8 years later in 2013, after undergoing a number of other jobs, such as a bit part actress and flight attendant, Becky was able to return to the ring, and return in a big way, as it was then she was signed to a developmental contract by WWE. But what of the injury she'd suffered from years before? Wouldn't this prevent her from performing going forward? Well, no, as it happened, because it wasn't as serious as it first seemed, and in the almost decade since it had happened, the future Women's World Champion had been able to fully recover. So not wanting to waste any more time then, the now rebranded Becky Lynch got straight to work on making a name for herself. First, by climbing the ranks of the NXT Women's Division as part of a backstage stable with Sasha Banks, Charlotte, and Bayley, and then by becoming the true breakout of 2018 and 2019 on the main roster. Yes, this was the period Becky morphed into the Man, arguably the biggest star women's wrestling has ever seen. Hell, such a big deal was she'd come out of the first ever women's WrestleMania main event as the double champ during that latter year. And after that, she'd continue to build on her legacy by beating every challenger who came up against her. At one point, in fact, she'd even beat our next subject, one of the ladies who'd served as such an inspiration for her during her youth, and that's Trish Stratus. Of course, by the time Trish Stratus retired in 2006, there really was no need for her to ever return again, as she'd chosen to go out on her own free will, not because of an injury the way so many other people we've discussed today did. So if she still had plenty of gas left in the tank then, why did she choose to hang up her boots at all? Well, the reason for this was that as a 7-time women's champion, she'd already achieved just about everything she could in the industry. With her getting the opportunity to go out on top with the gold around her waist, it made all the sense in the world to call it a day at this point. That said, clearly as the years went on, the wrestling itch started to return for the Canadian, probably partially as a result of her watching a whole new generation blossom and take the division to heights up until then unforeseen. So that was why she'd contact WWE in January 2018 and book herself a spot in the first ever Women's Royal Rumble that month, with this marking the first time she'd ever laced up her boots since the mid-2000s, outside of a couple of brief reappearances at the turn of the decade. Yes, technically Trish had already come out of retirement by the time 2018 came around, but what this return represented was the first time she'd be back on something closer to a full-time basis. And that's because after her Rumble appearance, she'd hit the ring again at that August's Evolution pay-per-view. And then once that was over, she'd have another match at the following year's SummerSlam, this time against Charlotte Flair. But even such moves paled in comparison to what she'd do in 2023, as it was then she'd re-enter the picture again when she began a feud with Becky Lynch. And it wasn't just Becky who ended up getting the rub from the Hall of Famer here either, because between February and September of that year, she'd mix it up with the likes of Damage Control, Raquel Rodriguez, and Zoe Stark as well. So given she can still clearly go at a high level and help younger talent get to the next level, we wouldn't be surprised to see Trish continue to come back to the ring from time to time again in the future, and put on a show stealer with an up-and-comer. After all, it's a pattern which has worked well for others in the past, with perhaps no one doing this more effectively than Mick Foley. But how did Mrs. Foley's baby boy help to get the next generation ready post-retirement in 2000? Well, by working with the people he saw the most potential in and doing everything he could to raise them to his level. And that was a very high level indeed, as during his first run as an active competitor between 1986 and the turn of the millennium, the hardcore legend worked in just about every major promotion there was, both in the West and out East, had a number of world title reigns, and even helped to put hardcore wrestling on the map for a new generation. Hell, so good was he'd actually get 3 separate characters over, with these being Dude Love, Mankind, and Cactus Jack. That said, once he made his first return in 2004, and there had an all-time great feud against Randy Orton, it wouldn't be any of these monikers he'd be going by. No, it'd be plain old Mick Foley, as by this point, that was the person fans had fallen in love with. And it would also be Mick Foley who returned in 2006 to have another 5-star feud against Edge, just as it would be he who then tried to give TNA the rub for a while when he signed on the dotted line with them in 2008. Sure, Impact was never able to reach the heights they could have in the end, but that was through no fault of Foley's. And that's why he can rest easy to this day knowing he did everything he could to help the future get going whenever he did make a comeback. Of course, he probably learned such an attitude from a man who served as both a close friend and mentor to him throughout his career, a man who's pretty much become synonymous with the idea of a wrestler coming out of retirement over the years. And that's because following his first retirement in the mid-80s, Terry Funk quickly found that he just couldn't stay away for long. But thank God he felt this way, because while the Funkster was great during his initial run as a technical wrestling wizard and former NWA World's Champion in the Territory days, it's arguably his second run which created his most memorable moments. After all, how could anyone ever forget his time in ECW, where he helped to legitimize the fledgling promotion? His period spent in the WWF at the turn of the millennium, or his repeated appearances at various indie companies over the years following this, where he did everything he could to impart his decades of knowledge onto the youth. Seriously, there's perhaps never been any other figure in the wrestling industry as giving as Terry Funk was. But it wasn't just his attitude outside of the ring which raised him to this level in the eyes of many. No, it was also his willingness to change with the times by adopting a completely different in-ring style at a point in life where most people were settling into retirement. Have you ever seen a man in his 50s do a moonsault for the first time ever? Well, if you were watching Extreme Championship Wrestling in the mid-90s, then you would have seen this. Just as a couple of years prior to that, you would have seen Terry venture out east again to take part in the IWA King of the Deathmatch tournament, one of the most mythical events for any wrestling fan during the tape trader days. Sadly though, as a result of his passing in 2023, we'll never get to see the Amarillo legend hit the ring again, but at least the lessons he imparted onto the younger generation are still being used to this day, and maybe his willingness to continuously reinvent himself once he came out of retirement will further inspire future generations for years to come.